The Inattentive ADHD Coalition's mission is to make it so that children with inattentive ADHD are diagnosed by the age of 8, and adults with inattentive ADHD are readily and correctly diagnosed when they seek help. Find out how and how you can help at iadhd.org.
Hi, everybody. So glad that you have joined us today. I'm Linda Roggli with the A-D-Diva Network, which serves ADHD women 40 and better. And I am here to talk about inattentive ADHD with two parents of inattentive kiddos. So we're going to talk about the reason we're doing this actually is because there is now a new coalition. It's called the Inattentive ADHD Coalition because inattentive ADHD is often misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed. And I'd just like to read you the mission statement for the Inattentive ADHD Coalition, which, by the way, you can find at iadhd.org. I, of course, stands for inattentive. Their mission says children with inattentive ADHD are diagnosed by age 8. Adults with inattentive ADHD are readily and correctly diagnosed when they seek help. And with me today, we have the founder of the Inattentive ADHD Coalition, Cynthia Hammer, and also Dr. Kristin Wilcox. Let's define what inattentive ADHD, because as I understand that there are three different, what is now called presentations of ADHD. There's the hyperactive kind, the rah-rah-rah kind, and then there's the inattentive kind, which is quieter, and then there's the combined type. So can you tell us a little bit about those three types?
Well, I think the hyperactive type is the type that's more commonly seen or more commonly recognized because it's more the child who's in your face, that's always busy, that might be talking when he shouldn't, or touching someone when they shouldn't, or out of their seat when they should be sitting. They're full of energy, but the inattentive type often has a much slower tempo. They're often quiet. They're not disruptive. They are shy sometimes, introverted. They could be thinking about other things instead of the topic they should be paying attention to. They're often forgetful. Some of their symptoms overlap with the hyperactive type, but they're presented in a different way. And often they've been harder to recognize, these children with inattentive ADD. I think sometimes it's because people don't know what to look for, but it's also because, especially with the girls, they try to mask their symptoms. They don't want to be different, and they work really hard to try to fit in. But even though they feel different and they don't know why, it's an uncomfortable place for them to be with their ADHD being undiagnosed.
So let's talk about your kiddos. So Kristin, what was your kiddo like? What was your son, and I believe his name is Andrew, what was he like before he was diagnosed, and what did you see as a parent?
Before he was diagnosed, we got a lot of information from the school, from one teacher in particular who actually recognized his symptoms when he was in 2nd grade, and he got an official diagnosis when he was in 3rd grade. We kind of created a paper trail. But he was, doing the typical kind of not doing his work in school and shoving worksheets in his desk. And then he would have to go down to the support room and miss recess because he would have to complete worksheets, getting up and disappearing to the bathroom for 30 minutes at a time, or going down and visiting the nurse, even though nothing was wrong, just to go sit in her office because he didn't want to be in the classroom doing, whatever they were doing in the classroom. And with my son, at least, it was mostly when he was doing English. That wasn't his favorite subject, and he didn't want to be doing the work. Math and science, he would generally stay in the classroom and he would do the work. So like I said, we had this, he had this teacher who recognized his symptoms because she had a son who was diagnosed with inattentive ADHD. And then we did have him officially evaluated in 3rd grade for it.
Got it. So she knew what to look for, in other words, which is great.
She did. And we were extremely lucky because 3rd grade is very early to be diagnosed with inattentive ADHD, especially in a boy who is more often recognized for the combined type because they're perceived as being more hyperactive. So if you have a boy with inattentive ADHD, it is difficult to recognize that in them, and they're more often thought of as lazy or stupid, or they just they're apathetic towards school, because they don't have the hyperactive in your face, up and down in the classroom, constantly talking and blurting out. So
absolutely. So what did you notice at home though? Or did you?
It was when he was younger, it was more noticeable at school because school was more regimented. So I think in general, it's more difficult to see these things at home because, well, I can say clean your room, but you don't have to clean your room right now. At school, you have to do the worksheet right now.
Exactly.
So it does present itself, I think, in a school setting earlier than you would see it at home. Of course, after we realized he was doing these behaviors, then it was easier to, see that he was doing some of these behaviors at home and things where I would say to him, clean your room, put your bike away. And, these were things, I would say, well, why can't you just put your bike away? And then I realized after a while, after he was diagnosed and I did some research on ADHD, well, he can't just put his bike away because, I tell him and he forgets, or, he'd rather do something else than put the bike away. So, but it was definitely more noticeable in school. That was the primary focus when he was younger, to get him on track at school. Like I said, because at home it's not as structured and it's not as regimented. So he didn't have to do things at that specific moment.
Okay, so I'm going to pose the same question to you, Cynthia, because I know your son was diagnosed with ADHD, a little bit older, but what was your child like?
I have 3 sons, but the son with inattentive ADD is called Brian.
Okay.
He's now 45 years old.
Oh, wow.
He was diagnosed when he was 13. And back then they did know about ADHD in children, but it was, again, mostly the hyperactive type. So I think we were on our own to kind of discover his ADD. We just, he had a lot of lovable characteristics, but we just knew something wasn't quite right, because when he finished grade school and was going to go on to middle school, which is a much bigger school where you have change teachers, just change classrooms, we just felt that our son would get lost. So we transferred him to a private school where he was one of 12 children. And yet even there, we got comments from the teacher how in gym class, he wouldn't be paying attention. He'd be looking at the light bulbs on the ceiling. And when I saw that, when I heard that, it just, I don't know why or where I was reading about ADD, but it turned on the light bulbs and I started to read about ADD. And the thing that was frustrating, which I think still holds true, is that I would read some symptoms and they would sound like him, and then other days that wouldn't sound like him. So we went back and forth for 2 years pondering whether he had this condition. And tied in with that, I think, is some parents' denial, or even now parents' unwillingness to label their child with this disorder. Although if you don't get them help, they're going to get labeled other ways, such as unmotivated or lazy. But so when we finally got him diagnosed, he started, back then there were only 2 choices for medicine, Ritalin or Dexedrine. Now there are probably up to 35 medications, including the delivery systems and the lengths of effectiveness. But when he started on medicine, his grades improved. We got along better at home. And the medicines are so fast acting that if he took it in the morning, he was improved right away. But if he didn't take it, I couldn't tell how he was different. I just knew on those days we got along less well.
Got it. I got it. So let's just be clear, the medications that you're specifically talking about that work quickly are stimulant medications. And there's 2 different kinds, amphetamines and methylphenidate, which is, and as you say, the delivery systems are wide ranging and how long they last and all that kind of good stuff. So Kristin, tell us about what happened after your son was diagnosed, after Andrew was diagnosed, what differences did you notice? You said you began to notice, oh yeah, that was probably inattentive ADHD back then. But what happened after he was diagnosed, and how was he treated? Did your pediatrician do the diagnosis?
Well, we had him, he was evaluated by the school psychiatrist.
Oh, school psychiatrist.
And yes,
Okay.
we had the school psychiatrist come in and evaluate him.
Okay.
And then, so she did the official diagnosis, and then there was
Mhm.
another behavioral specialist that came in and evaluated him as well in the school
Yeah.
system. And so they wrote everything up, which the pediatrician had. And then when I showed him, the graph of all the responses, he made the official diagnosis that Andrew had inattentive ADHD, but it was the school psychiatrist who actually diagnosed him with the inattentive type.
All right. And let's be clear about who can diagnose ADHD. Psychologists can diagnose, nurse practitioners who have a specialty in psychiatry, psychiatrists can diagnose. Is there anybody else who can diagnose ADHD out there in the world? Officially, I'm talking about, not just, I think you have it. Yeah.
Any kind of physician.
Okay.
Yeah, I would, physician.
Then? Yeah, I got it. Okay, cool. So
but even though they all can, I think it's very important for people to find people who are familiar with it and have been in the field for a while. Because otherwise, you might have people that don't recognize it or believe if you're getting good grades in school, you can't have it, or they have other mistaken beliefs about how ADHD presents. So you could waste time if you don't go to see someone who is experienced and has knowledge in ADHD in children.
Tell us about what differences you saw in Andrew after the diagnosis and after treatment, apparently.
He was put on medication. He took Vyvanse. And we definitely saw an improvement. He did the disappearing out of class ended, so he wasn't going to the bathroom for 30 minutes. He wasn't going down to the nurse, his handwriting improved, which sounds funny, but that's how I could actually tell when the dose of his medication needed to be bumped up, because his handwriting became just atrocious. He was taking more care on his assignments than he was prior. So the medication definitely helped. We also instituted a 504 plan for him, so he had academic accommodations, that also helped him. But even after he was diagnosed and put on the medication, he still had struggles. So when he got into middle school, so Cynthia was saying, kids that are very bright, they don't necessarily, they kind of get passed over. But when he did get into middle school and the course load became more, and he was, had the trouble with the disorganization and the time management, he still struggled despite the fact that he did have accommodations at school and he was on medication. He would have been way worse, if he didn't have treatment, for sure. So there was a lot of me advocating for him and helping him to manage his ADHD once he was diagnosed, and learning about his ADHD and learning that he just couldn't start his homework and clean his room and put his bike away. He needed very specific, tasks, like, if I said, clean your room, that wasn't going to work. But, then I learned that, okay, if I say, clean your desk off, or clean your nightstand off, or put your clothes in the hamper, very specific tasks, those he could do. So, I'm grateful again that he was diagnosed so early, because I think he would have gotten into middle school and I think he would have failed classes in middle school if he wasn't diagnosed. So, once he was diagnosed and we could help him manage that, was definitely, a blessing.
So you mentioned 504 plan. Can you explain what a 504 is? And then I'm going to ask Cynthia to talk about an IEP. So can you talk about what a 504 is?
Sure. So a 504 plan is a plan that students can get through their school and you meet with advisors at the school and counselors, and you come up with a list of accommodations for your student to help them perform better in school. Like Andrew had accommodations, like, well, he had to sit by the teacher. He also had extra time on tests. He was allowed to verbalize ideas to the teacher if he had to do a writing assignment, because writing assignments were extremely difficult for him. So if he was allowed to go up and verbalize the answer to an essay, or verbalize something that he would have to write about in English class to the teacher, instead of actually having to write it down on the paper. He was allowed later on in middle school and in high school to use his laptop to take notes, because physical writing is difficult for kids with ADHD. But he couldn't write fast enough. As the professor was talking, he could type much faster, so he was allowed to.
And that brings up something both of you have talked about, is when things are boring, ADHD folks aren't going to be
unmotivated. Yes, he's not going to do it, like freshman seminar.
I got it. But the piece of that is that people without ADHD kiddos who don't know much about ADHD will say, well, I'm bored too, but I had to do it anyway. Right. I just forced myself. But it's not that they don't want to entirely. They don't, but they literally cannot do it. They can't focus on it. So it's really difficult.
They can't motivate themselves to do something that they dislike or is uninteresting.
Then let me tell you what an IEP is. Because my son not only was ADHD, but he didn't have an IEP for ADHD, because he, like your son, is now in his 40s. But he did have an IEP because he was legally blind. He had albinism. So an IEP, the I stands for Individual Education Plan. So that means that there may be pull-out programs. For my son was pulled out of the regular classroom to work with a special person who worked with low vision kiddos. ADHD kids also have this stigma. They feel like, I don't want to, don't. It used to be that they, and maybe, Kristin, maybe they still do this, pull kids out to take their midday medication. Do they still do that for kiddos?
That's why Dr. Dodson really feels it's worthwhile to get the long acting for your children, even though it's more expensive. It reduces that stigma of having to leave class during the day.
Absolutely. I love that. And the medication that Kristin mentioned, the Vyvanse, is a long-acting stimulant. It's a stimulant medication based on the amphetamine side of things. So that makes perfect sense. So did you see stigma when your kiddo was diagnosed with ADHD? Maybe I should go there a little bit, Cynthia. Did you see that? Because he was 13, and 13 is a difficult age for boys and girls. So did you hear any stigma about that?
Well, I guess no one knew. I didn't tell his teachers. We just gave him medicine. And so I have to say, my son's story hasn't turned out as well, because we always had hopes he'd go to college. And so even after he finished private middle school, we sent him to a private high school, still thinking he'd go to college, although he wasn't that interested in academics. And on reflection, we might have been better sending him to the public high school where my other children went to school, where they had trades. He could have trained as a car mechanic. So sometimes it's the parents giving up what their hopes and dreams are for the child to focus on what the child's interests are. And my son, he got to a point where he wouldn't take medicine. And at a certain point, as a parent, you just stand back and let them live their lives as they're choosing to. You've done your best to help them and so he recognizes, he says, I feel like I'm more of an adult if I'm taking my medicine. I'm able to follow through on things, but it's his choice not to.
Got it. That makes perfect sense to me. And thank you for saying that, because parents have to go through a grieving process when a child is diagnosed as being different. And I'm not going to say that it's oh my gosh, it's a diagnosis, it's terrible. It's just that they're different, but parents have an expectation of what they expected that child to be. As you say, we expected him to go to college, and but failing that expectation doesn't mean failing as a child or as an adult. So can you say a little bit how you handled that disappointment? I mean, I understand that you look back and say, oh, maybe we could have done it differently. How did you handle it in the moment, though, when you realized, oh, I don't think he's going to go to college?
Oh, boy. I'm sorry, Linda, I can't respond to that. I don't know if at that point I was too focused on myself, because I had gotten my diagnosis by then. And
yeah.
I realized that my whole first year I was in a grieving process that I didn't really realize. It was like after a year, I said, oh, I've been grieving. So I had another child that was taking a lot of attention because of unruly behavior. So one child might have gotten overlooked at the wrong time. And I know my husband feels that he wasn't involved enough with this middle son with the inattentive ADD. So I guess in a way, it's hard to give each child the attention that you think they need. Absolutely. And you have to forgive yourself as parents if you didn't do as well as you thought you could have done.
And I think that's true for every single parent in the entire world, no matter whether you have ADHD kids or not. But I think you bring up an important point that often ADHD parents are raising an ADHD child. And if their ADHD has not been treated or they haven't learned the skills, there's a saying in the field, if you will, that pills don't teach skills, just as you have to have, I need you to put your bike away, not go out and take everything out and put it in the garage. So parents often haven't learned that for themselves. So it's hard to teach it to an ADHD kiddo. That certainly was true for me and my son. He was inattentive. I was combined type, but I tended to have more of the drive and high energy. So we went like this a lot. Now we could look back and say, oh yeah, it must be your ADHD, mom. So, it's better now that he's an adult, but it was difficult. So there's so much to know about ADHD. Kristin, it sounds like you kind of dug in, and I mean, not only did you graph the pattern, it sounds like you really dug in and tried to learn more about ADHD. How did you do that? And what would you recommend to parents today about places that they can find resources besides the coalition?
I did dive in Andrew became my mission to help him and to help him be successful. And I think mostly because I saw Andrew's potential. I saw that he was bright and he could be successful. And I was afraid that, people wouldn't recognize that about him and he would be denied opportunities because he had ADHD and they wouldn't recognize, well, you have ADHD, but you're really creative and you're an awesome problem solver. And, yes, you can go into a GT program and, so I did kind of dive in and learn about it. And so that I could advocate for him. And like I said, it took me a long time to learn to work with his ADHD and realize he wasn't like me. He wasn't going to organize things like me. He wasn't going to, come home right away and do his homework like I used to do as a student. He wasn't, that's not the way he operated. So it took me a long time to understand that and to kind of let him do his own thing to help himself be successful. And I read a lot. I joined CHAD, which is children and adults with ADHD. They have a lot of resources. Attitude magazine online has a lot of resources, but just, get some books out of the library and, just read them and learn about your child, read articles online to find out how your child's mind works, how their brain works, and then learn how to work with that, because that's how you're going to help them to be successful. Talk to your child's doctor and ask them who would they recommend. When Andrew was seeing a psychologist, I asked her, I said, who would you recommend that I, get more information from? And she, told me Russell Barkley was a good person to, go and, read some of the things that he wrote and to get information from. So definitely talk to your child's doctor and see who they recommend.
Cynthia, I know that you were involved in ADHD. You worked with ADHD resources even before you founded the coalition. So you knew a lot about ADHD. What prompted you to get so involved in ADHD? Was it your ADHD? Was it your son's? Was it the combination? Tell us a little bit about your journey to learn about ADHD.
Well, I guess after I got diagnosed, I went to the first adult conference. It was held in Michigan. And when I came home from that, I decided to just start a support group, which I did, and it kind of failed. And then because it was a small group meeting at the hospital, and I didn't really know how to run a group where everyone was coming in with different abilities and different backgrounds with their ADHD. And I trained to be a coach and did that for a few years, and then I retired. But during COVID, I had received a memoir, yes, from a friend from college. And that gave me the idea to write my memoir during COVID isolation. So I started to write a book about just my life, but I don't know, I thought it was pretty good. So then I hired an editor, and he told me, we're going to just make this about your inattentive ADD, your life with inattentive ADD. And he asked me a lot more questions. We added a lot more material to the book. And in that process, I just started to feel that inattentive ADHD is too often undiagnosed in children, incorrectly diagnosed in adults. So that was the motivation to start the new nonprofit.
Got it. Oh, Cynthia, I just want to thank you on behalf of all of us for all the work you have done from that first, what you consider failed support group, to now of all the work that you have done to support ADHD parents and their kiddos and adults with ADHD, not just parents with ADHD kiddos. But I know ADD Resources was one of the first places that I ever heard about Dr. Bill Dodson. He was one of your keynote speakers, and I'll never forget driving down the road. Back in those days, it was cassettes that I was playing in my car. That's how long ago it was. So thank you for everything that you've done. It's so important. And I also want to point out
I wanted to bring one thing up, Linda, because I think when you say work, that I did work, I think for most people with ADD, when they're in their passion, it doesn't feel like work.
Yeah,
it's almost joyful.
Yes.
And so, I mean, that helps you to know to get your children into their passion, because it's going to make them enliven them and give them their spark in life.
So, I'll comment on that, what Cynthia just said. So our son, we just dropped him off at college, 800 miles away in Florida. And when he was in high school, he thought maybe he might want to go into the Coast Guard, and we thought, oh, this is great, very hands-on, very appealing. He wanted to do, avionics, which is electronics on aircraft, and that was totally his thing. He's been, interested in aviation and aerospace ever since he was a toddler. So, but he said, okay, if I get in this one school in Florida, he said, that's where I want to go. And it's a school that specializes in aviation and aerospace. And so we said, okay, so he got in and he decided this is what he was doing. I'm still a little nervous that, he might not maintain his grades, but, to Cynthia's point, if he's going to go to college, this is probably the best place for him to go, because it's small, it's extremely specialized. My husband and I, when we just moved him there like 2 weeks ago, we were counting all of the kids walking around with, NASA t-shirts on and space themed t-shirts and everything, and just looked at each other and we're like, yeah, these are his people. This is where he belongs.
I wanted to tell a brief story about
so it's important.
Thank you, Kristin. Yes.
I wanted to tell a brief story about Dr. Pomeroy, who is also in one of the videos in this series, because he never was a good student, but he wanted to be a physician. And when he went to medical school, he got like almost straight A's. And years later, when he got diagnosed with ADD, he was asking the therapist, how could that have happened? And she said, well, obviously you were in your interest and area of passion. And so even without being diagnosed with ADD, just being in your passion made a huge difference to how well he was as a student.
Oh, that's a
And I
great
think
story.
that's an important point for parents, recognize what your child's passion is and kind of push them in that direction, because they'll become experts at something and they'll become super successful, especially when they spend the majority of time being criticized because they can't do something. So if you push them into their passion where they can really excel and really shine, I think it makes a huge difference.
What is the most important thing that you want people to take away, parents or grandparents or even teachers who may be watching this? What's the most important thing that you really want that you want to leave them with? Cynthia, you want to go first?
Well, I think the most important thing is don't delay on diagnosis and treatment. The earlier, and we're finding this out more and more from research, the earlier a child is helped, the bigger difference it makes. And without the diagnosis, their lives are at greater risk of accidents, health problems, social, emotional issues. So the key is early diagnosis of your child.
Good. Thank you so much. Same question to you, Kristin. What's the most important point you want people to take home, or 2 points? It's okay.
Yes, I have 3 points actually. The first one is learn to work with your child's brain, recognize they are not like you, and learn to work with their ADHD and how their mind works. The second I would say is advocate for them. I spent a lot of time, sent a lot of emails to Andrew's teachers about, how he learns and what his strengths were and what his weaknesses were, and, to help him stay on top of assignments and projects so his grades wouldn't, drop. And I would say the last one is to, point out the positives in your child. Like I mentioned before, they're most often recognized for things they can't do, and they're not celebrated for the things that they can do.
Absolutely.
So, point out the positives.
Absolutely. I love that, because you're right. They get so many negative messages, not only from outside, but eventually they begin to internalize it and they begin to beat themselves up.
They can't do it, or they're, Andrew has said to me more than once, I'm stupid, I can't do this. And no, you're not stupid. You just have to, take your time with it, or try it a different way, or,
Absolutely. Thank you so much for mentioning that. I really appreciate it. Okay, so both of you have books. I don't know, Cynthia, if your book is published, but I know that Kristin's is published. Tell me the name of it and how people can find it.
Well, it's Andrew's Awesome Adventures with His ADHD Brain. And it's helping children and parents to understand inattentive type ADHD, and it is available on Amazon.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Cynthia, how about your book? Did your memoir get published?
It's my first and only book, and I don't know what the process is, but right now I'm on the third edit of the manuscript, and I don't know. I'm asking them, what does it mean for when it will be published? So maybe I'll have information soon, but.
Well, check the website. You'll be able to find that out at remember, Inattentive ADHD.org. I'm sure you're going to hear a big announcement about when Cynthia's book comes out about her inattentive ADHD. Thank you both so much for being with us today. I know that people have learned so much about ADHD, and there's much more to learn.
This has been a production of Inattentive ADHD Coalition. Check us out at iadhd.org and see how you can help us by donating or by spreading awareness about inattentive ADHD. Thank you.